Good morning, everyone. Morning. So I'm welcoming people here in person and also people online as well. It's my great honor and pleasure to be introducing our next keynote speaker, Professor Ray Gibbs. Professor Gibbs was a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of California, Santa Cruz for many years. And he's now an independent cognitive scientist. I love the independence there. He's undertaking groundbreaking research on indirect and figurative meaning, irony, metaphor, and those kind of things, as well as embodiment in cognitive science. So Professor Gibbs' work is really trailblazing and I think really important for us in Pragmatics, actually. So really good stuff to read. He's got a lot of seminal monographs, including one on figurative thought and language, intentions, which is still really good. I wish more people would read that one, embodiment, and also metaphors as well. And he was editor of Metaphor and Symbol, which is the top journal working on figurative language in the field for 17 years at least. So a real contribution to the field there. So we're very excited to be hearing Professor Gibbs' work, exploring the relationship between metaphor and embodiment in his keynote talk entitled Metaphors in the Flesh, Pragmatic Poetics of Sports Celebrations. So I'm just going to hand across to Ray here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I think you should be able to share your screen and ready to go.
Let's see. There we go. Great. Thank you very much, Michael. Appreciate it. It's my great pleasure to be here with all of you because I love pragmatics, of course. Talking to you about metaphor in the flesh, pragmatic poetics of sports celebrations. The motivation for this work is that I happen to love watching sports on TV, and I do it constantly every day of my life if possible. And I want to start off with an example that I came across a number of years ago. All right, sorry about that. I had a little problem with advancing the slides, but I got that figured out now. So anyways, as I said, I watch sports a lot, and I find these interesting things when I see sports on television. And here's an example of this. This is from an American football match, a professional football game. And this particular player had caught a pass from his quarterback and he ran into the end zone for what is known as a touchdown. And the referee raised his arm saying, yes, you scored a touchdown. And then he celebrated or appeared to be celebrating by going and doing this action. And so the question is, what is he doing here? I mean, he's jumping up and taking the football and he's slamming over the goalpost. And what does that mean? Is he just happy or is he trying to communicate something by that? And my suggestion here is that what he's doing is saying that what I just did on the field playing football, scoring a touchdown, is similar to what you do in basketball, where you very forcefully score a basket by slam dunking the ball into the rim, into the basket. And the goalpost actually is exactly the same height as a basketball rim, which is at 10 feet. So he's making this kind of comparison between what he just did and this accomplishment in a different sport. Here's another example, also from American football. This gentleman, he was playing defense and he intercepted a pass from the opposing team's quarterback and he ran it back down the field, which is to a great advantage to his team. And then he was pushed out of bounds and he celebrated by going over to the sidelines and enacting this particular little performance where it appears as if he's mimicking taking an arrow out of a quiver, sticking it into a bow, releasing the arrow, and look at his head here. He nods as if, I've hit this target. So perhaps what he's doing here is communicating that I've just did this play on the field, which is similar to I shooting an arrow and hitting perhaps an enemy and defeating the enemy. So he's making kind of a metaphorical comparison between what he did and this other kind of competitive action. This is from the great Brazilian soccer star, if you don't mind, I'll call it soccer, Neymar, who ran down the field, kicked the ball into the net, and then ran over in celebration to the corner of the field, pick up the flag that was standing there, and goes on one knee and he points the flagpole as if it is a rifle toward the other team. So what is he doing here? What is he trying to perhaps communicate by this? And again, there's the possibility that he's doing something symbolic, something metaphorical, as if to say, my scoring a goal as if I am actually shooting at, hitting, and hurting, and perhaps killing or defeating the enemy in battle. So he's making kind of a metaphorical comparison there. This is another one from American football. This guy runs the ball into the end zone for a touchdown, and he immediately does this kind of action with his arms, and it happens very quickly. But essentially what he's doing is like he's making pretend that he's swinging a baseball bat, perhaps to hit a home run. So scoring a touchdown in football is similar to doing the most important thing you can do in American baseball, which is hitting a home run. So he's making a comparison between what he did and this other kind of great act in a different sport. Now, this is a different American football one. This is a defensive player who battled and ran across the line of scrimmage and tackled the opposing team's quarterback behind that line of scrimmage. And this is known as a quarterback sack. He sacked the quarterback. And this is a very big play because it pushes the other team back down the field. And what he's doing here is if he's fishing and he's caught something important, like a big fish, and then he holds it up for everybody to see. So in other words, he has caught the big one, which is exactly what he just did in the football game by sacking the quarterback. He caught the big one in the game. Now, this is a celebration which is now banned because it's seen to be too violent, although football itself is an extremely physically violent game. This gentleman, too, sacked the quarterback behind the line of scrimmage, and then he is acting as if he is just mowing down with a machine gun members of the opposing team, like he's defeating them, as if he's killing them. His action sacking the quarterback was like this other violent action in a battle. Finally, this is one in basketball. This is a gentleman who shoots the ball from a long distance away, and it's actually a three-point shot. It's worth 3 points. So he holds up his fingers to say, that's 3 points. And then look what he does with his hands. It's as if he's putting his pistols back down into his holster, as if he was just in a kind of gun duel and he successfully shot and injured or perhaps defeated an opponent, and he's resetting his pistols back into his holster. So you see a lot of these things in the last recent years and in many kinds of sports, particularly in professional sports. And the question is, what do these mean? And as a person interested in pragmatics, it's wonderful because all I've had to do for the last several years is sit on the couch and pragmatics comes out of the TV and falls into my lap. It's an incredibly rich source of data. And I want to tell you about what my thoughts are, because I think some of these things are metaphorical depictions. By that I mean, if I said Martha's PhD thesis was, and then I swung my arms like I was swinging a bat to hit a home run, I'm communicating something metaphorical. Like her PhD thesis was really a great thesis because she hit a home run doing it. And this contrasts with the linguistic version or the metaphorical description where I would state it out explicitly, like Martha's PhD thesis was a home run. So these celebrations, or at least many of them, I want to argue are metaphorical depictions. But they're more precisely what I want to say are metaphorical pantomimes. They're pantomimes which are nonverbal, mimetic, and non-conventionalized means of communication that are executed primarily in the visual channel, and they're usually done by controlled movements of the whole body. So these are, in a sense, pantomimes that these athletes are enacting as part of their celebrations. Now, what I'm suggesting here is that some of these celebrations are, again, metaphorical pantomimes, which are celebratory actions that express a salient part of a successful source path goal event from a different sport or some other competitive domain. So they're doing from sports like baseball, competitive sports like when you're in battle or so forth. And so in a sense, they're referring to or drawing a cross-domain mapping, which is very much the mark of metaphor. But what they do typically is they rely on a metonymy. They only enact part of the sequence and have that stand for the whole sequence. So the player, when he scores a goal in soccer, he runs over to the side of the field and picks up the flagpole, and he just is pointing at the other team, but you infer from that the whole sequence, that he actually pointed at the other team, he fired at the other team, he hit the other team and defeated the other team or the opponent. Metaphorical pantomimes are pretend actions. People aren't really shooting one another. They're not really hitting home runs. They're not really out there fishing, but they pretend as if they are doing these particular actions in these other domains. And they often employ real or imaginary props, like the guy who was swinging a baseball bat didn't really have a bat, but he was as if he had a bat. And they sometimes can use props like the flagpole to stand for something like a rifle. And importantly, they offer commentary, not only in the players not just to say, oh, I've done this thing, but they want to offer a kind of pragmatic commentary on what the person just did on the field. So the hypothesis that underlies the work that I want to tell you about was that athletes readily enact these different kinds of celebrations. And ordinary spectators, even people who aren't particularly familiar with sports, readily interpret certain of these celebrations in metaphorical terms. And they can do this relatively easily because they think metaphorically about a lot of things in terms of their unconscious conventional metaphorical concepts, particularly regarding successful competitive achievement. So a lot of these, for example, refer to like sports as war, or playing a sports as engaging in war. And that's a kind of common metaphor that we use at times to interpret some of these celebratory actions as having metaphorical meanings. So enacting a metaphorical sports celebration in the way, do not just simply communicate metaphorical meaning. It's not just simply a matter of, okay, here's the metaphor, but they're trying to convey something about the social significance of what they have just done. The metaphorical celebrations then I want to argue, communicate an athlete's bragging rights over the other team. And this is the big part of pragmatics. So not just simply communicating metaphor, but they're using the metaphor to communicate bragging rights. In a sense, they're using metaphor to do various kinds of what we can call face work. Now, not all celebrations are metaphorical. So let me give you some examples of ones that I think may not be metaphorical. This is also a case where a player sacked the quarterback behind the line of scrimmage, and they do various kinds of dances. That's a little sexualized. This is Ronaldo, another great soccer player who scores a goal, and he runs and he slides on his knees. This is a common celebration you see in certain sports, particularly soccer. And you see players just simply dancing. So this guy has scored a touchdown in American football, and he goes through this dance routine. Now, these are different than the ones that I showed you earlier because they mostly just simply express the player's emotional reaction to what they just did. They're happy because they just scored a touchdown. The non-metaphorical celebrations are not pretend actions. For example, the guys, when they're dancing, they're really dancing, not pretending to dance, they're really dancing. And they don't typically refer to goal achievement, but they're really simply, again, bodily expressions of joy or happiness given what they just done on the field. So there's a difference between the metaphorical ones and the non-metaphorical ones. And part of what I was interested in was to see if people could distinguish between these. So I'm going to tell you about 4 studies that I've conducted. One is an analysis of a kind of a cognitive linguistic analysis of individual celebrations where a single athlete celebrates something they've just done. The second study looks at how ordinary people, many of which are not necessarily sports watchers, how do they make sense of these celebrations? And then I want to tell you about a different kind of celebratory actions where a group of athletes get together and collaborate and perform almost like a skit. And then finally looking at a study where to see how ordinary people interpret these kinds of group celebrations. And again, my general interest is to see if in fact people distinguish between the metaphorical ones and the non-metaphorical ones, And what meanings did they get out of these, particularly the metaphorical ones? So in the first study, I collected 48 different celebration clips that you can find on the internet, in which I would gather from watching sports on TV a lot. These lasted and ranged from 3 to 12 seconds. Most of these were from American football, where these celebrations are quite prominent, but some from soccer, some from basketball, and I have one from ice hockey. And most of these occurred during a stoppage in play after some big event had occurred. And typically the sequence is like this: the athlete makes a great play in the field, and then they kind of move away from other players to peer kind of quote unquote on stage. And then they perform the celebration, which is not really an action that's related to the sport they're just playing, but they're more parts of a more elaborate scenario. And then they often sometimes give indications of achieving a goal by, for example, snapping the head to suggest that they actually hit the target when they were shooting an arrow. And then after they've done their celebration, they rejoin their teammates and continue celebrating, perhaps in a different way. So what I did is I collected these 48, and with the help of another researcher, I asked 5 questions of each one of these. First, did the celebration enact a scene from a different sport or some other non-sporting competitive action? Yes or no? Second, did the celebration include some real or imaginary prop? For example, the use of a flagpole as a rifle? Yes or no? Did the celebration act some or all of a larger source path goal schema or routine? So looking at a celebration that suggests killing or defeating an opponent in battle? Yes or no? And did the celebration enact a salient part of the source path goal schema, where one part of it stands metonymically for the whole thing? So pointing the flagpole at the other team stands for shooting at and hitting an opponent in battle? Yes or no? And then finally, for each clip, did the celebration performance appear to be a pretend action? So the soccer player was only pretending to fire a rifle at the other team. So did this analysis, all 48, and you end up with data that look like this. So here are the 5 questions at the top. And so the slam dunking the basketball, the answer was yes to all of them. For this one dab move, which is a kind of dance that certain players do, the answer was no to all of them. And some of them have yes answers, and some of them have, and also at the same time, some no answers. And so then what I've performed is what is called a hierarchical clustering analysis, which tells me which of these celebrations are closer to one another, given these 5 criteria. And it performed a very nice analysis. So there were 32 actions that were in one group, and 16 different actions were in a different group. So in the first group, the actions were typically not related to other sports or competitive context. They weren't related to source path goal sequences. They didn't typically involve pretend actions. And so these are things like a guy scores a touchdown in football and he starts twerking his butt dance, or he performs a snow angel, makes a snow angel on the ground, or he places an imaginary phone to his ears if he's talking to somebody, or a player performs this particular dance on the ground, or as I showed you in one clip, he runs and slides on his knees. And I want to suggest that this first group are generally the not metaphorical ones, and they only celebrate on the field achievement without further commentary on what they just did. It's just a celebration of happiness. The second group of 16 items referred to other sports or competitive contests. They were related to source path goal sequences. They were metonymic in the sense that, like many kinds of metaphorical gestures, you do a part of it, and that stands for, expresses the whole sequence. So, for example, these include the flagpole rifle, a case where a guy scores a goal in soccer and runs and pretends as if he's tossing a grenade into the stands and not killing the other team, but killing all of the fans on the other team. The bow and arrow one I showed you, the home run swing I showed you, and there's another example where a guy pretended to be winning a sprinting contest. And so in the second group, these are metaphorical, I want to suggest. They communicate the importance of play by alluding to achievements in some other sport or competitive contests. They're pretend actions generally, and they often allude to victory or defeat in some way. And they're not just simply expressions of emotion. So we have these two groups of actions, of celebrations, one mostly the non-metaphorical and some are metaphorical. And so then I wanted to look at, excuse me, how people who are not necessarily sports people understand these or interpret what these things are about. So in the second study, I presented 6 of the clips from the first group and 6 from the second group. And I had people read them, or excuse me, watch them. I gave them a little context about what each one was about and what had happened, and they showed the clip. And I generally was predicting that people can interpret the metaphorical and the non-metaphorical ones differently. They're going to see the metaphorical ones as referring to cross-domain mappings, pretend actions. They involve metonymy. Moreover, and this is really important, the metaphorical clips communicate additional meaning beyond the expression of emotions, and they give rise to these metaphorical interpretations, unlike the non-metaphorical clips, which just simply look at the express emotion. So I asked people, after watching each clip, gave them a series of statements, and they had to rate their agreement on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the most agreement with each one. So they would see, for example, the slam dunking of the football over the goalpost, and then they would see the statement, scoring a touchdown in a football game is like successfully slam dunking a basketball in a basketball game. And this was to get to see if they understood metaphorical meaning. And of course, each question was tailored to each clip. But in general, people gave much higher ratings to these kinds of questions, having seen the metaphorical ones than the non-metaphorical ones. So they seem to interpret the metaphors in the metaphorical ones, and less slow did they do this for the non-metaphorical ones because they weren't that metaphorical. A second statement was the player was only pretending to slam dunk a basketball into the basket, but was not really doing this action. And again, people saw the metaphorical ones as having much more involving pretense than was the case for the non-metaphorical ones. And then the other question, that statement was the player performed the slam dunking of the basketball action, not only because he was happy, but also to show everyone that his play on the field was quite negative for the other team. So this is this little extra bit of pragmatics that I think people were communicating in the metaphorical celebrations. And in fact, people did see this happening with the metaphorical ones by giving these higher ratings, significantly so than was happening when they saw the non-metaphorical clips. So we see there's differences. They're treating these and understanding these as being different. But then I asked them a general question to describe in words what the connection may be, if any, between scoring a touchdown in a football game and slam dunking a basketball in a basketball game. Again, given the one clip where he scored a touchdown and he went up and slam dunked the football over the goalpost. And I wanted to see if they understood this general metaphorical understanding and what else they had to say. And so people wrote out a lot of stuff in response to this. And there's a bunch of things they could do. They could just simply describe physically what happened in the celebration. They could acknowledge that some of these actions were pretense. They could note that sometimes the athlete was communicating the process of achieving a goal, or they were communicating their skill or their expertise. In some cases, they were just simply expressing their emotional state or what they were thinking, like they were happy. Sometimes they expressed that there was a metaphorical relationship going here. They mentioned as if, or they mentioned that this is relating to this other domain. Sometimes they talked about how the celebrations disparaged the opponent or just were showboating on the part of the athlete. And in some cases, they wrote they didn't know what was going on. And without going into all of the details, here's the gist of what people answered in response to this question. So when they saw the metaphorical ones, they saw that these were metaphorical depictions that relied on imaginary objects from different domains, and they didn't do that for the non-metaphorical actions. They recognized and spoke explicitly about the metaphorical depictions alluding to source, path, goal, source domains from other areas. So, oh, the person's dunking a ball as if he's playing basketball. So they recognized the other domain, and they also recognized how part of the action stood for the whole sequence. So the part of the action actually stood for the whole sequence where a person actually achieved successfully a goal. But they also noted for the metaphorical celebrations, but they didn't do this for the non-metaphorical ones, that the person was communicating a pragmatic message beyond the metaphorical meaning alone. So they would say things like, he dunked the football to show up the other team, or the athlete suggested that his scoring a touchdown must be really embarrassing for the players defending him. They noted this kind of face work stuff, that it wasn't just the metaphor, it's actually saying something negative about the other team or even the other team's fans. And again, they did this for the metaphorical ones, but not nearly as much for the non-metaphorical celebrations. The non-metaphorical ones were described in very literal physical terms, not like the metaphorical ones. And the non-metaphorical celebrations, again, mostly illustrate the player's state of mind, what they were thinking emotionally at the time, their happiness given that they just done something good on the field. All right, so in a third group study here, there was a change over time in some of these celebrations. Some of these professional sports leagues outlawed certain celebrations because they thought that they were offensive or too violent. And there was a lot of public discourse about these, whether or not they were good or bad, or were they too disparaging, were they unsportsmanlike when they did some of them. There's lots of discussions about this in the media, but they started all of a sudden to develop, and these sports leagues allowed these group celebrations. And these are just totally cool. So here's an example from professional football. So the guy on the left, number 17 there, he had just caught a pass for a touchdown. And so as soon as he did this, his teammates ran up into the goal line zone there, end zone, and they lined up as if they were bowling pins. And the guy rolled a fake ball and he knocked down all the other pins. He's essentially suggesting that my scoring a touchdown is akin to my throwing a perfect strike in bowling, where I knock down the pins, thus I defeat the other teammates, the other people, the players on the other team by my action. So it's a lovely metaphorical celebration, if you ask me. Here's another one. Now, this is quick. They first start to shake hands with one another, and then they go into this duel mode where the guy who scores a touchdown basically lunges at and stabs and kills one of his teammates, showing that he was the victor in this little battle. So the teammate was, again, sort of taking, for the moment, the position of the opposing team, and the guy was defeating him in a battle. This is a thing that American children play called, these are potato sack races, where you get this big bag where potatoes come in and you pull it over your legs and you try to have these jumping contests. And the guy on the right was the one who just scored the touchdown. And so basically he defeated these other players who were representing for the moment the other team. So he was the victor. So again, these are really cool because they really explicitly show their achievement of victory given what they just done. Excuse me. And this is a great one. This is soccer. What are you doing to celebrate? Fishing? Throwing in the fish. Here comes the fish. Here comes, what do? You catch a big fish. You show it. And someone takes a picture. Beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful example of a group celebration where my scoring a goal is like my catching the big one, and they perform this lovely little skit to show that achievement. Now, once again, not all of the group celebrations were necessarily metaphorical. So here's a case where some guys were just dancing in a very rhythmic manner. This is where they're playing leapfrog, which isn't really a competitive action. It's just something that they do. And again, here's another kind of dance celebration that a group of guys did after scoring a touchdown. So these are ones which I don't think are metaphorical compared to the earlier ones, which I think were explicitly metaphorical. So I gathered a corpus of 24 of these group celebrations. These were a little bit longer than the individual ones, lasting up from some 6 to 23 seconds. Most of them were seen in American football because that's where a lot of these are occurring these days, a couple from soccer. And again, what I did is I asked of each one, with the help of another researcher, in this case, 6 questions about each one. Was the celebration related to some other sport or some other kind of competitive contest? Yes or no? Did the action include some real or imaginary prop? Yes or no? Did the action relate to larger source path goal sequence? Did it enact part of that sequence? So there was a metonymy there. Was the action a pretend performance? And then specifically for these group celebrations, there was an interesting pragmatics going on here that the players from one team actually momentarily adopted or represented players from the other team. And so was that occurring in each celebration? And again, so I had these patterns of yeses and nos. Some of them were no, some of them were yeses all the way, some of them had some mixture. And I again did this hierarchical clustering analysis, and it showed 2 very distinct groups, one with 8 celebrations and a second group with 16. So for the first group, the 8, these are things like dancing like the New York Rockettes, which is a famous musical routine, playing leapfrog, kissing the foot of a player who just scored a touchdown, or a bunch of athletes group jumping up and doing a high five slap with one another. And so this group, I want to suggest again, are probably not metaphorical. They don't involve pretend actions, and they really mostly just celebrate the on-the-field achievement without further commentary on what they had just done. They're just expressions of emotion. The second group, the larger group, involved where the team engaged in a tug of war, where the player who just scored was on the winning side. The potato sack race I showed you, where the guy who scored a touchdown was the victor of that race. The bowling pin examples, a case where there was a boxing match between players, and then the reeling in the fish example. And the ones in the second group are generally metaphorical. They refer all to sports or some other competitive contests. So there's a cross-domain mapping there. They're all pretend actions, many of which have props, and they offer further commentary in the plays. They're not just simply the player expressing their happiness. Now, unlike the first group, the first couple studies on the individual celebrations, where only a third of them were metaphorical, most of the ones in this group celebrations, what I found, are metaphorical. So there's more metaphoricity as these celebrations develop over time. So in the fourth study, I want to finally look to see, how do people interpret these group celebrations? Very simple experiment. I had 5 from the metaphorical celebrations, 5 from the non-metaphorical ones. It was a quick study, and I only had, each participant only saw one of each type of these clips, presented the clips, gave them some context, and I asked them some questions. So the first thing I asked each participant is, what do you think the players are doing in this video? And what, if anything, were they communicating to others through their actions? So this is a very open-ended question. And they wrote down all sorts of different kinds of things, but there's some things you can analyze here. And so, for example, for the literal actions, they said this, a lot of the non-metaphorical ones, they just simply said what the player is doing, and they described what was going on physically, literally. And they did this far less so with the metaphorical ones. They saw the metaphorical clips as involving pretense. They mentioned that explicitly, far more so than with the non-metaphorical ones. And perhaps not surprisingly, they explicitly acknowledged there was some kind of metaphorical or as if relationship between the achievement on the field and the celebration. And they did that for the metaphorical ones, but never did that for the non-metaphorical ones. The non-metaphorical ones were primarily seen as expressions of the state of the mind or the emotional state of the athlete. And that's far less so the case for the metaphorical ones. And then again, quite notably here, the metaphorical ones, people acknowledge explicitly that it was something about achieving a goal on the field. And that was never the case for the non-metaphorical ones. So they're seeing these as being quite different from one another once again. They also talked about the social significance of the play. So they would say things like, oh, for the metaphorical ones, that he was slapping down the other team, or they were putting the other team in their place, or they were showing up the other team, or they were showing the other team who's the boss of the game or the match. They made these kinds of kind of face work questions or comments, as I like to have it. And they did that far less so for the non-metaphorical clips that they saw. I also asked them, do you think that the players, explicitly, I wanted to ask them, do you think that the players were pretending what they were doing? And they said that almost all of the metaphorical ones they were pretending, but hardly any of the non-metaphorical ones were. Are any of the players in this scene adopting the role of players from the opposing team? So did they get this kind of nuance, this pragmatic nuance? And people saw that, yes, that's exactly what they're doing. And they're doing this almost exclusively for the metaphorical ones, but hardly ever for the non-metaphorical ones. So when they're dancing together, none of them are actually pretending to be players on the other team. They're all actually still representing their own team. So people readily infer the metaphorical meanings when viewing these metaphorical group celebrations. There's more pretense, there's more metaphorical relations they acknowledge. They're specifically recognized that there's a reference to goal achievement for the metaphorical ones, but not so with the non-metaphorical ones. And they also recognize that some players were pretending, for at least momentarily, to be players on the opposing team who were being defeated in all these other celebratory actions. Now, I just really want to tell you that this is a long study with lots of details. I did do a kind of corpus linguistic study where I took each celebratory action and I tried to paraphrase it in words, like doing a slam dunk or hitting a home run or dancing wildly and sliding on their knees. And I looked this up in the corpus of contemporary American English. And the point that I found was that the metaphorical ones often were used much more metaphorically in language than the non-metaphorical ones, not surprisingly. So although the corpus did talk about slam dunkings of basketballs, there were at least 50% of the times where the term slam dunk was used, that was used metaphorically, referring to some other thing, like, someone's getting tenure as a slam dunk, or Mary's thesis was a home run. So what this suggests is that in part of what the athletes are doing for the metaphorical celebration is that they're enacting verbal metaphors and doing them in a completely bodily way. So they're showing the bodily roots of these particular things. So there's a connection between, therefore, the metaphorical descriptions and the metaphorical depictions. All right, now I want to take a slight side sequence here to comment on another thing about the importance of face work in these celebrations, because I think that's critical to what they're about. And I want to give you an example, and this is kind of a verbal case, but it's a personal story, and I hope you don't mind my telling you this. This is about a time back in 1982, and I was this postdoc at Stanford University, and I happened to be 27 years old, and I was in my prime time years of playing basketball. And a couple times a week, I'd go to this park where there was a basketball court, and people from the community would come, and we'd have these pickup games of basketball. And these guys were good, and these were competitive games, and it was really a big deal. I enjoyed it tremendously. So I want to tell you about one game. So we get out there and we pick up sides, and the game starts, and a player from the opposing team that I was on made this incredibly beautiful basketball move where he ran and jumped up high, and he basically spun himself around, and he laid the ball up beautifully over the rim, right over the guy who was trying to defend him. And he then landed on the ground and he turned and he stopped and he screamed at the guy, "In your face disgrace," because he had just kind of defaced the guy by that move. That guy couldn't stop him. And he wanted everybody to know that he had just kind of defaced the guy. So this is explicit, in your face. Then we continue playing, and I happened to be guarding a guy on the other team who was a very good shooter. And he would shoot a lot, and he made a bunch in a row, and he was really good. And he had this annoying habit of every time he shot the basketball, just as he shot it, just as it released from his hands, he would spit into my face the word face. He'd go, face, face. And then he'd hit a bunch of these. And so there was not much I could say because he was actually, achieving what he wanted to. And it was kind of me being defaced because I wasn't able to stop him. And then there was a time where he missed and someone else grabbed the rebound. And I looked at him and said, "Hey, that's in your face, dude," because it gets competitive out there. And then another time he shot and he missed. And I grabbed the rebound and I said this thing. I said, "That's a premature celebration." And this is one of these times in life where I didn't have a sense of an intention inside my mind that then I articulated through language, but rather, I didn't know what was in my head. I said something, and then I listened to the words I said to recognize what I meant. And I meant to draw a cross-domain mapping to, excuse me, I'm sorry, a premature ejaculation. This is toxic masculinity going on here. This is what it was like back then. And, it's a common male sexual thing, not a big deal. But I was thinking there is this relationship here. He's announcing this thing, but he's not actually following through in what he was promising. And when I thought that and realized I was making that kind of sexual connotation here, this is all in the space of about a couple seconds. I'm going, no one's going to be able to understand this connection here. But then 2 seconds later, another player in my team yells out, "That's what his girlfriend says." And then another player in my team goes, "He ain't got no girl." It's like that when he's all alone. And so, my friends, we were getting at it. And I'm not going to describe to you what the next 45 to 60 seconds of discourse were, other than to categorize it. It was pragmatics in the gutter, because we just ripped apart this guy. These other players on my team went after this guy's manhood, his sexuality, his ability as a basketball player. They just tore him apart in about 45 seconds. And you can tell that he was really upset by this. And so we started playing again. And my guy was shot a couple times and he missed. And I felt bad for him, actually. And I saying, "Hey, just keep shooting your shot. You'll get it." And then at one point, my guy again was dribbling the ball. He looked really disturbed by everything that just happened. And I was guarding him and was seeing what he was going to do. Was he going to pass the ball or shoot? When all of a sudden, a guy behind me in my team went, "PC." And then I went behind him. "Okay, PC." And then all 5 of us on my team were going, "PC." We were taunting him. We were mocking him. And I looked at the guy as I was covering him again, and his eyeballs were rolling in his head. This guy did not know what hit him. And he was worthless for the rest of that game. My team lost. My team won. The game was over. This all take place in about 5 to 6 minutes of time. There was a break in the action. We went over to the side, took drinks of water, and then we chose up sides for the next game. And the captain, one of the captains, as we're picking up players, he says, "I'll take PC." My friends, PC became this guy's name. And I'm sorry that I take personal delight in this, because there's a very important lesson here for sports celebrations and face work, which is the following. If you're going to start a face war, you'd be better prepared to finish it, because if you won't, I will. This guy was spitting the word face right into my face each time he shot the ball, but he wasn't able to finish it. And now, my saying premature celebration, I am perhaps living up inside his head for the rest of his life. So you got to be careful. If you're going to celebrate, to whatever gesture you do, whatever word you say, you got to be able to finish it. Now, it turns out that when I started many years later to do this research I was just telling you about, I found a website that was called Embarrassing Premature Celebrations in Sports. I went, oh, wow, great. And it has all of these videos of all these places where athletes do these embarrassing premature celebrations. So things like in football, there's dozens of these where guys are running down the field and they're about to score a touchdown, but before they get to the goal line, they drop the ball because they start celebrating too early. They start dancing or doing some skit thing, and they just mess up and they drop the ball and they don't score the touchdown. Or in basketball, a guy will shoot the ball and he'll wave to the crowd and start dancing a certain way before the ball has even gotten near the basket, and then he'll miss the shot, and then it's embarrassing for him. In Korean professional baseball, they have this habit, which is you don't see in the United States, of if they hit a home run, they flip their bats way up in the air. And there are cases of them doing that prematurely because they flip their bat and it turns out the ball does not actually go out of the park. It's not actually a home run. And the one that I happen to love, which you saw early on in professional football particularly, is that when there's a match going on and one team is beating the other team, there's no question that they're going to win the game. But late in the game, the other team scores a touchdown finally. And that player starts dancing around and doing his celebration. And then one of the players from the opposing team goes up and taps him on the shoulder and points to the scoreboard and say, hey, look at the scoreboard because, dude, you're going to lose. You're celebrating, but this is premature. It's because you ain't winning this game. We're winning. And then they start celebrating because they just showed up the other guy. So there's a lot of showing up. There's a lot of face work going on here and putting down the other team. That's a big deal of what goes on in these sports celebrations. And I also want to say that I love the fact that there was this website on premature celebrations, because very early on when I was doing this work, I was talking to another person who was doing Pragmatics, and I showed this person some of the clips, and they just didn't think anything was going on here. They didn't see anything symbolic. They saw no metaphor, and they thought nobody out there in the world would be interested in this. And I said, oh, well, we'll see. And it turns out, I'm happy to report that the embarrassing premature celebration website has been viewed 7,167,000 times as of June 2019. So there's at least 7 million people who care about at least some aspect of these space work and sports celebration things, which I think is marvelous. Now, I should note here one other kind of interesting complexity, and there's a lot of these pragmatically in these celebrations. I showed you one this earlier of a guy scoring a touchdown, and then he was celebrating doing this dance. And as it turns out, and I knew this because he was playing a team where another player who's a defensive player always does this particular dance whenever he makes a great play in the field. And so this guy had just run past that guy to score a touchdown. So he's doing his dance, and it's ironic. He's mocking the other player who's standing 10 feet away watching this. Like, hey, I'm now doing your dance. And so it's, again, very much a matter of face work and putting down the other guy. So conclusions. Athletes provide bodily commentary on the significance of what they have just accomplished. And they do so in part because they're not able to verbally say things, often in large crowds, and they want people to see what they think through their bodily commentaries. The non-metaphorical celebrations do not express metaphorical ideas. They're not typically seen as pretend actions. They don't use metonymy to refer a part to refer to a whole. And they don't typically convey larger pragmatic messages. They're mostly seen as simply expressions of joy on the athlete's part, given what that person has just done on the field. But people can readily interpret some of these as being metaphorical sports depictions. They view these as pretend actions. that metonymically again refer to achievement in another sport or some other competitive event, such as which is a cross-domain mapping. And these celebrations convey symbolic meanings beyond pure emotion. And they particularly, this metaphorical ones, convey the athletes' beliefs about the relative importance that their plays have in the ongoing sports contests, but also their mastery in their respective sports, as well as their dominance over opposing players and teams. So again, these are very much matters of face work where they're trying to, show that they gain face through their accomplishment, and the opposing team, as well as the other fans, have lost face as a result of their achievement on the field. Many of these metaphorical sports depictions are motivated by common metaphorical concepts, such as sport is war or playing sports is engaging in a war. And this idea reminded me of a famous quote by George Orwell. He once wrote, "Serious sport has nothing to do with fair play. It's bound up with hatred, jealousy, boastfulness, disregard of all rules, and sadistic pleasure in witnessing violence. In other words, it is war minus the shooting." But what is going on with these celebrations is they're showing the violence. They are showing the shooting because people are shooting rifles, they're shooting arrows, they're machine gunning down each other, they're knocking each other with punches, they're slashing throats, they're tossing grenades into the stands. So in a way, the celebrations allow people to show the war by other means in some cases. Now, I should point out that, although a lot of these are due to wars or commentaries from other sporting events, there's some other very unique ones which are slowly emerging. So one in American football where a guy scores a touchdown and he gets into the end zone and he gets on his back and he puts the ball between his legs, pulls his knees up, and then another player comes and kneels in front of him and they wrestle over this football, and finally they pull the football out between his legs and they both get up and present it to the stands, the fans, as if he just gave birth. So scoring a touchdown is giving birth. So there's all these kind of non-violent, non-competitive sports things. And this is one that I just saw the other day. This is the American National Basketball just had its championships, and my local team, the Golden State Warriors, won. And this is one of the best basketball players in the world, Steph Curry. So towards the end of the game, as he made these great shots and it was clear that his team was going to win, he was doing this night-night thing, where it's basically he's putting the other team to bed. Betty bye, because they're no longer going to be awake. They're done. And his teammates on the sideline were also doing this back to him. So there are these other kinds of metaphorical depictions that are emerging that aren't just simply all about violence. But this is one they're doing this quite frequently in the last couple of days after the Golden State and San Francisco won this NBA championship. So there are people out there in the streets enacting this metaphor, which is totally cool. The reason why I like this work is because in the study of metaphor, we think of it as a kind of thought or a kind of language, but I want to say that metaphor is always a pragmatic action. Metaphor is something we do, and we always need to think of it in terms of those doing aspects. It's a full-bodied performance. And a lot of the emphasis in the study of metaphor, I think, is too often looking at how we use pragmatics to derive the metaphorical meaning. But in most cases, we don't just simply use metaphors simply to communicate metaphor alone. We want to communicate these other things beyond the metaphorical meaning. And I think that's what these sports celebrations are doing. They're showing their face work, showing the superiority of one person over another opponent and over another team, as well as their fans. I like this because I think human beings have this fundamental impulse to do metaphor throughout their lives in many diverse contexts. And I think these sports celebrations is another beautiful place where you can find metaphor. And I always say that we don't just live by metaphors, but we do metaphor as how we meaningfully live our lives every day. So thank you very much for your attention, folks. Sorry for the mess up at the beginning. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I wrote down a lot of, I like Pragmatics in the gutter. That's
Yeah.
volume, that one. So questions from the audience. I think we have one of our other folk monitoring online as well. Wow, there's a long question there. I'm not sure if you can see it, Ray, in the chat.
Yeah, I can see it here. Okay, so this is a question about people. How did they? I'm reading this very quickly. The question is, what do you do with these celebrations if you don't know much about sports, or particularly you don't know about the rules of football, about the rules of baseball? And I actually looked at this in terms of my participants.
Looks like it's going into losing connection. Just sorry, Ray, you may notice we've lost your connection just here. Oh, yep, you look like you're back again. Yep.
Okay, sorry.
Can you start your answer again? Sorry, you just.
Yeah, sorry. The question has to do with whether or not people who are not familiar with sports or familiar with a particular sports, how can they understand some of these actions? And the simple answer is, for the individual celebrations, I did some early work which showed that the more expertise you had, the more time you had spent time watching sports, the more you were able to infer the metaphors. But as I ran later studies, that wasn't the case. Everybody seemed to get those. So I didn't see an expertise effect anymore. So that's kind of interesting that even novices seem to be able to get the metaphoricity of some of these, even if they didn't know anything about the sports per se. They seem to infer something about the other actions and what they were depicting. And so I was very much struck by that, but that seems to be the results I've been getting the last few times I've been doing these studies.
You know, that's interesting. I had the same question, but yeah. It's interesting because I think in the audience, I don't know, I'm just looking around. I don't think many of us know about American sports, but I think we could get what was going on.
Yes.
Maybe not as deeply as you understand it. But yeah, basic ideas, right? Yeah.
I mean, certainly the more you know about a sport, the more inferences you can get. So the guy who knew about that one particular player that he was mocking another player, he had watched a lot of sports. And so the more you know, the better you get. But again, people can generally get these without knowing a lot.
It's amazing. So we do have some questions.
Thank you for your presentation. I enjoyed it. I was wondering if you took into account the notion of spontaneity versus scriptedness. Like, it seems to me, especially as a group action there, they seem to be scripted beforehand. And also, if you talk about motivation, if there is a kind of commercialization going on here, this is a form of branding for the for the player and the team, and if that affects your interpretation.
I'm not sure how to answer I mean, what do you mean by branding? Can you say more about that?
Well, a player wants to be known for a special move.
Yes.
This is a signature move.
Yes. In fact, that's true. Yeah, so they are doing that. That's very much so. So part of their challenge is to creatively come up with some new performance, and so that they're trying to one up each other in that, as well as in terms of what they're doing on the field of action. The question about deliberate, certainly, you know, particularly for the group ones, they've certainly probably have maybe even practiced them before, so they were doing them intentionally, deliberately. The question is whether or not when they were doing them, were they doing them as deliberate metaphors per se, or were they just saying, hey, let's do this one skit? Were they cognizant of the fact that they were creating a cross-domain mapping? And I'm always hesitant to try and, you know, attribute too much consciousness to metaphoricity in people's minds just on the fact that they do metaphor in language or gestures or celebrations. You have to be careful, because sometimes they can do something metaphorically without necessarily being very conscious of the category of metaphor per se. And then certainly there are some cases where the celebrations seem to emerge spontaneously, given the existence of a prop that was nearby or something, particularly props, like the goalpost. I think that happened simply because the goalpost is right there and it was appropriate time. And so they took advantage of it and they used the goalpost to do a slam dunking. So yes, I do think sometimes they consciously put these skits together, but whether or not they're consciously saying, oh, let's put on a metaphorical skit, I'm not sure of.
Thanks for that. I think, do we have a question? Yeah, in the back here as well. We're just moving the mic around for you, Ray. So
yep, no problem.
Well, thank you so much for the presentation. Super interesting and new somehow. I do not know anything about sports. This is the premise. But I was wondering while listening to you whether the same amount of information or the same amount of pragmatics comes to your sofa even when watching a game of a more individual sport. I have in mind tennis, for example, because I was wondering if there's any, group effect or something that has to do with the fact of being a team. And the hidden question is also about sex differences automatically connected to this.
Yes, sure. The sex difference, I actually have collected some examples of women celebrating in sports, but they're far less frequent. And that's partly because of there are more explicit rules against that in certain women's sports. But I just didn't have enough to decide to include those in this study. I should also say that a lot of these celebrations died down during the pandemic because a lot of these sports started taking place without fans. They were just in these stadiums without any fans. And so a lot of these celebrations just disappeared because a lot of cases, these athletes are doing these for the sake of the fans. But the women's one, there are a couple ones the women's do. None of them were metaphorical per se, but they were more individual celebrations. Like in tennis, they've done it. And I guess in soccer, you've done it, but that's a team sport. You do see them in some individual sports. But it's also like in baseball, you see it a little bit, and that still is an individual sport because a guy individually hits a home run. And even though it is representing his team versus another, it's still very much seen as I just myself alone did this thing. But again, it depends on the rules of the sport. Some sports simply don't allow these kinds of things and they'll penalize you. Like college teams in America, they get penalized if they do some of these actions because they're seen as unsportsmanlike. So, but these are, that's a good question about individuals versus teams, but they mostly happen in the context of teams.
I'm just checking if there's any other questions. Yeah, there is, yeah.
Thank you very much for your really interesting talk. I've enjoyed it really much. I would like to ask, you have said that there is some forbidden movement, like group violence or something like that it's actually forbidden or not permitted.
Yes.
Are there any other movements which are not permitted, and what is maybe the common feature of these movements, whether it's this group violence or something other?
The other is sexualized movements. Those have been outlawed by the American football in particular. And in at least in America. Now, let me just, if you don't mind, let me raise one. Sometimes when players, you see this in soccer in Europe, they will grab their crotches when they've done something and do that very noticeably for the other fans to see. So it's basically they're doing this crotch grabbing thing. And that's not outlawed, I don't believe, in soccer and international soccer, I don't think. But you would see that being outlawed in a lot of American sports, at least football and baseball. Although baseball, I'm unsure of that. It used to be allowed, but then they'd fine people for it. So sex and violence are the ones they're trying to control.
Sounds like not a bad idea, right?
Yeah.
I think we could keep asking questions all day here, but we've got to take a break and move to
Okay.
sessions, but I wanted to invite everyone to join me in thanking you again for your talk.
Yes. Thank you all. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. I hope you all have a good time. I wish I were with you.
Wonderful. But thanks so much for your talk, Ray.
Cheers. Cheers. Right. Bye.